happened about 100 years ago when you have Teddy Roosevelt as the champion trust buster. You know, when you're in school, you learn how he's a great trust buster. He broke up Standard Oil. Well, not really. Teddy Roosevelt was the paralegal's other candidate. And by other candidate, I mean the period of Woodrow Wilson. What the paralegal did, and one of the paralegal members was Bernard Baruch. According to Curtis Dahl, FDR's son-in-law in this book, you know, My Exploited Father-in-Law, he used to think that FDR was really smart, Wilson and all that, but he described how Bernard Baruch would lead Woodrow Wilson like a puppy dog up to meet his handlers, these very powerful people. And when they got finished telling Woodrow Wilson what he was expected to do if they allowed him to become president, they chuckled to themselves and said, okay, let's see how our other candidate is doing, by whom they meant Teddy Roosevelt. What they were doing there was splitting the vote between President Taft and Teddy so that Woodrow Wilson would be allowed to come in. And so what you have with Teddy Roosevelt is you're given a general perception how he's this, you know, really great for the little man and trust buster, but all he really did is split them up, split Standard Oil up, so they became a multi-headed hydra. The key was they had interlocking directorates. So even though you split them up, you really didn't split them up. They had the same key people in key positions meeting and doing their dastardly deeds. And that's what the deep state's really good about. They'll put layers. So it's not like you can just come in and say, okay, you're gone. They have all these laws that are interrelated, and you actually have to, it's like a maze you have to go through, and you have to unravel it piece by piece. Now, one of the fellows who brought me to Washington, named Robert Sweet, and he was a campaign manager for Reagan. He was in charge of the National Institute of Education, which was part of the department. That's where all the research funding was done, which is where I went. Right now, he's trying to get back into this deep state, and he's actually going through all of the legislation. It's a meticulous process, but he's going through, and he's presenting now to the head of the Education Committee in the House, who's from the state that I'm from, a list of particulars. Say, okay, this is coming up for reauthorization, gone. This date will be up for reauthorization, gone. You go step by step. It's a difficult process. It can be done, but it is hard.
That's really the problem that you have. That's the real, I would say, the real government, like you're saying.
That's right.
What's also interesting is when we hear all these fights say about, well, the Trump administration had all this secret communication or whatever it was with the Russians. But we just have to look back very briefly, and we find a whole bunch of Democratic politicians had equal relations. This is just surface dressing on a squabble. That's all it is. It's just for a political gain. It has nothing to do with the reality of what's really happening. Moreover, a lot of times people like to yell conspiracy theory or stuff when you begin trying to talk about these machinations. But let's take the communist one. That was decried quite frequently back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And yet it turns out we know the place was crawling with communists. There were over 500 agents working to destabilize our government and infiltrate.
That's right. And there's a word I use about temporocentric. They've actually conditioned the people. It's like Orwell said in 1984, what if we quicken the tempo of human life? You have so much change, and the tempo of human life has been sped up so much that the memory of people is shrunk. First of all, they dumb the people down. The people today, they're very good. The millennials about their own specialization, information technology. But outside of that, they really don't have much smarts. And their memory, they've been conditioned to not think in terms of the past. So they start with, okay, who cares about 200-year-old dead white guys? And they ratchet that forward so that about 30 years ago they started, all right, now here we are playing some music, and it's 1992, and we're going to play some good old golden oldies from 1985. So you collapse the focus of attention of people. Then you get them thinking in terms of sound bites. And so if you ask people, the Democrats do this, they say, what? They don't even remember that the Democrats, let's say, or leftists, were doing the same thing under Clinton, for example. They don't remember it.
No, I understand. And that's why, theoretically, the business of the media would be to bring that to people's memory to do it. But now the media, they're a branch office right now of the deep state. And so they're not about to point this out, which is what the independent media are doing. They've stepped in to, it's the best of the capitalist system. They have failed. Somebody else is doing it.
And that, too, has been going on a long time. You would have, I think it was Seymour Hersh, was covering up stuff that the Soviets were doing. Herman Dinsmore was foreign editor of the New York Times from 1951 to 1960, and later on he wrote a book called All the News That Fits, where he actually admits, we were covering up Castro and what the communists doing. And the whole McCarthy bit was one big distraction and cover-up as well on the part of the media. There was a guy, I think his name's Hobhouse. I got him in one of my books about the Cecil Rhodes group from over 100 years ago, and he's writing about the London Times, and he says, look, it's not just important what they tell you or what they do publish, it's what they choose not to tell you, which is just as important. So they've been at this selectivity for a long, long time. And not only it keeps the public ignorant, it's a means of distraction. I remember when I was in the Reagan administration, it always used to amaze me how there would be this crisis, and everybody would dash somewhere, like to Nicaragua to cover the Daniel Ortega doing something, and then all of a sudden, that was no longer a problem. I said, well, what happened to Central America? Well, we're on to something else.
Yeah, and so if what is logical doesn't seem to be happening, some other agenda's afoot, and that's what you're looking at.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, I just thought we'd go a little more into the deep state, especially since we've had all these things about surveillance of American citizens, and of course that just provides them with ammunition with which they can function, knowing what people are up to, and then if people become too pesky, the Obama administration weaponized the Internal Revenue Service to keep nonprofit conservative groups from getting 501c3 status. This is a sort of a major above the horizon shift in that government is being used as a power to control certain groups, which it's supposed to be neutral towards.
Two things. Don't forget that this power elite that's been around a long time that's behind these sort of things, that they do from time to time psychological probes. For example, during the last campaign, that's what Bernie Sanders was doing. He was going to win, but it was a psychological probe to see how successful they had been in conditioning the millennials to support an outright socialist. Also, I have a book that I did back in 2010 called The Power Elite and the Secret Nazi Plan, where what they also try to do, and part of the secret Nazi plan involved, quote, create doubts among the people of each country as to the ability, integrity, or wisdom of their leading statesmen. So what they try to do is they have the public conditioned to mistrust a lot of people. So part of all this of constantly, let's say, challenging Trump or whoever it is to create that doubt. The secret Nazi plan was developed right after Pearl Harbor and is coming to fruition today. So when you see that type of thing going on, that's part of the secret Nazi plan.
Okay, Dr. Dennis Cuddy, website and any of your latest books you'd like people to read.
The latest book I have is called Conspiracy, and a lot of my books are who did what, when, and what they said, but this particular book is a how book. And the next to last chapter in the book, Conspiracy, is actually titled Conspiracy because it's a lengthy chapter going from myself and a skeptic. I lay out how they did this and how they did that. And then the final chapter is about Common Core because that's a particular important controversy today. A lot of people look at politics and economics, but not much attention is paid going deeply into education. And that's a real problem because if we had actually looked at what was going on in the schools and spent more time, then we may not have had the problems that we wind up with today.